United Kingdom is now in an increasingly fragile financial position, with public debt reaching around 95 to 96% of gross domestic product, or GDP, making it one of the highest among advanced economies. Over the past decade, various events have contributed to this sharp increase, including the COVID-19 pandemic, the energy crisis triggered by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as a renewed energy shock driven by the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, alongside inconsistent government policy decisions. The Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, an independent body that produces the UK's official economic forecasts, has projected that if the current fiscal stance remains unchanged, total public sector debt could rise to very high levels over the next 50 years. So in this video, we will look at how the UK is facing an economic situation that is becoming increasingly risky. Keep watching. There are several clear indicators that conditions in the UK, particularly in the economy, will become worse if the government continues to rely on borrowing to finance its budget deficit. Efforts to reduce spending are also not easy, given that the UK has made international commitments to increase its defense budget to around 2.5% of GDP in the coming years. These steps were agreed together with NATO partners and are also driven by current geopolitical pressures, particularly from the administration of Donald Trump. In this climate of uncertainty, their economists are divided, with some warning that the current situation is repeating the pattern of the 1976 economic crisis, when the UK government was forced to seek emergency assistance from the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Behind the major issue of public debt, there are also other domestic issues, such as the condition of the UK Parliament building at the Palace of Westminster, which is increasingly dilapidated and requires repair works costing more than £3.5 billion. However, the country's main priority at this time is to manage its growing debt burden. By the end of 2024 and into 2025, the UK's debt level remained close to the size of its annual GDP, while its fiscal deficit was around 4 to 5%, meaning that government spending was far larger than the revenue it collected. The total national debt is now around £2.9 trillion, almost matching the entire annual value of the UK economy. This leaves the government with limited fiscal room for maneuver, should any new economic shock occur. The OBR and the UK Public Accounts Committee have issued stern warnings that if fiscal policy is not changed, debt levels could remain high and rise significantly in the decades ahead. Since 2020, the UK has gone through two major shocks: a global pandemic and an energy crisis. During this period, government borrowing jumped to around 15% of GDP, and although conditions have become more stable after the pandemic, the government has continued to borrow around 4 to 5% of GDP every year over the past few years. The impact of these policies has kept UK public debt at a high level, above 95% of GDP. The situation in the UK is even more worrying because, compared to other advanced economies that have also seen rising debt, the UK continues to record large and persistent deficits at a time when interest rates are rising and economic growth is sluggish. Geopolitical tensions and disruptions to global trade have further compounded these difficulties. In addition, an aging population has reduced the potential tax base, while pressure on the government to improve public services continues to increase. In this environment, the government is forced to spend more money, while tax revenues are not growing in tandem. On top of that, global interest rates have risen to their highest levels in about 15 years, making borrowing costs more expensive. In 2024, the UK recorded one of the larger budget deficits among European and advanced economies, with the gap between spending and revenue still wide. Through 2025 and into 2026, UK government borrowing has remained high by international standards, reflecting the ongoing strain on its public finances. As of mid-2025, yields on 10-year UK government bonds were around 4.5%, making the UK's borrowing costs among the highest in the developed world. Moving into 2026, these yields have remained elevated, close to 4.8 to 4.9%, signaling that investors still demand a high return to hold UK government debt. These high bond yields mean the government's interest payments have also increased. If this situation persists, it could undermine the country's financial stability, as more money has to be spent on servicing debt. Investors are also increasingly worried because high inflation is expected to remain a challenge for the next few years, which could erode the real value of their investments in the UK. Even more worrying, the UK economy is now experiencing stagnation in terms of productivity. Since the 2007 to 2008 financial crisis, UK productivity growth has only been around 1.5%, a very low rate compared to previous decades. This problem is known among economists as the UK productivity puzzle. It stems from a lack of investment in technology and infrastructure, workforce skills, and a labor market system that relies more on low-paid and insecure jobs rather than automation and innovation that could boost efficiency. This issue has clearly held back long-term recovery and kept the UK economy lagging behind its global competitors. The Labour government under Prime Minister Keir Starmer recently proposed several saving measures, such as cutting winter fuel payments for wealthier pensioners. However, this proposal was dropped after facing strong opposition from members of the party itself. At the same time, the UK government is also planning to raise taxes. In June 2025, the UK government recorded net borrowing of £20.7 billion, around £3.5 billion higher than the official forecast by the OBR. This was the highest monthly figure since the 2020 pandemic, and the increase in borrowing was largely driven by a surge in interest payments on government debt, which rose to around £8.4 billion in just 1 month compared to the same period a year earlier. This shows that beyond the sheer size of borrowing, the cost of servicing the debt is becoming an increasingly heavy burden on the government. Many analysts view the current UK economic situation as repeating patterns seen nearly 5 decades ago. In the early 1970s, the Conservative government introduced a spend-for-growth strategy to stimulate the economy. Unfortunately, this strategy had the opposite effect, with inflation surging, the value of the pound plunging, and bond yields rising sharply from around 6% to nearly 18% by the early 1980s. As a result of this economic instability, the Conservative Party lost the 1974 general election, leaving the crisis to be handled by the Labour Party. In 1976, then Prime Minister James Callaghan was forced to seek a £2.3 billion loan from the IMF. It became the largest loan ever granted by the IMF to an advanced economy and is remembered as one of the most humiliating moments in the UK's economic history. Now, there are fears that history could repeat itself. Once again, the Labour Party has inherited a challenging economic situation after winning the general election in July 2024. The country's fiscal position is shaky, with public spending far exceeding government revenue, which mainly comes from taxes. To close the gap between income and expenditure, the government only has 2 options: raise taxes or borrow more. However, both options carry their own negative implications. Higher taxes can reduce consumer spending and slow economic growth, while borrowing, on the other hand, must eventually be repaid with interest. Nevertheless, unlike in 1976, today's UK has one major advantage: full control over its own currency, the pound sterling. Most of the country's debt is also denominated in its own currency, so the government is less worried about foreign exchange risk. This means the Bank of England can play an active role in stabilizing markets, including through quantitative easing. That is, creating more money to buy government bonds, stimulate growth, and push down borrowing costs. This is a major advantage that countries tied to a shared currency like the euro do not have. However, printing money is not a simple solution. If done excessively, the value of the pound will fall, the purchasing power of the people will decline, and inflation could spike even higher. Therefore, although the Bank of England can act as a lender of last resort, its tools must be used carefully and in a targeted way. Furthermore, the IMF's 2025 Article 4 consultation report also stressed that the UK needs to make difficult fiscal choices over the long term to keep its debt under control and prevent it from harming the wider economy. Meanwhile, debates among UK politicians are becoming more heated. Amid constant blame shifting between political parties, voices among economists are also split. Some believe IMF assistance is not necessary because the UK still has powerful monetary instruments and a large financial market. However, others warn that if reforms are not implemented soon, the country will face difficulties rolling over its debt, paying pensions, and funding various social and welfare commitments. Professor Jagjit Chadha from the University of Cambridge, for example, has warned that without bold fiscal reforms, the UK's financial burden will grow heavier and threaten the country's long-term stability. On the other hand, there are experts who argue that the UK does not need IMF help because it still has the Bank of England, which can create its own money if necessary. Ultimately, however, everything comes back to the policy choices the government will make in the near future. What is clear is that although the UK is not yet officially in a crisis like in 1976, the country now stands at a dangerous crossroads. All the key economic indicators are flashing early warning signs that if corrective steps are not taken, a major crisis could occur at any time.